The convoy of black SUVs rolled to a stop outside the smallest, oldest garage on Mercer Street, and every wealthy customer standing in that parking lot froze. Doors opened. Security men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the cracked asphalt like they expected danger. Then a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out of the center car, walked straight past the confused onlookers, past the gleaming Mercedes and the Range Rover getting an oil change, and into the oil-stained workshop where a 61-year-old black mechanic stood wiping his hands on a rag. The billionaire's voice cracked as he wrapped his arms around the old man in grease-stained coveralls. "Dad," he said, tears running down his face in front of everyone. "I'm finally home." Nobody in that parking lot understood what they were witnessing. To understand it, you have to go back 28 years to a rainy October night on Interstate 40, and to a decision one tired man made in about 4 seconds that would echo across 3 decades. Isaiah Brooks was 33 years old the night his life changed forever, though he wouldn't have called it that at the time. He would have called it a Tuesday. He'd closed the garage at 7, later than usual, because a transmission job had run long, and he was driving home in his old Ford pickup with a thermos of coffee going cold in the cup holder. The rain had started around 6 and hadn't let up, the kind of steady October rain that turns headlights into smears and makes every driver on the road a little more dangerous than they mean to be. Isaiah had the radio on low, some gospel station out of Nashville, and he was thinking about nothing in particular, maybe what he'd eat for dinner, maybe the bill he still owed the parts supplier when he came around the bend near mile marker 44 and saw the wreckage. A sedan had gone off the road and wrapped itself around a guardrail post. Steam, or smoke, rose from the crumpled hood, and the rain hissed against hot metal. There were no other cars stopped yet, no flashing lights, nothing but Isaiah's truck and the wreck in the rain. He would tell people later, on the rare occasions he told this story at all, that he almost kept driving. That's the truth. People don't like to hear about heroism, that it usually looks for 1 or 2 seconds, exactly like the temptation to keep driving. But he didn't keep driving. He pulled onto the shoulder, put his hazards on, and ran through the rain toward the car. The driver, a man in his 30s, was already gone. Isaiah could tell that much even before he reached the door. The woman in the passenger seat was unconscious, blood on her temple, and Isaiah would learn later that she died before the ambulance arrived. But in the back seat, secured in a car seat that had somehow held through the impact, was a little boy, maybe 5 years old, screaming so hard no sound was coming out, his small hands white, knuckled around the straps. Isaiah broke the back window with a tire iron from his own truck bed, cut the boy free, and pulled him out into the rain, holding him against his chest while sirens finally started wailing somewhere in the distance. The boy's name, the paramedics would learn from the wallet in the wreckage, was Adrian Cole. His parents were Daniel and Marissa Cole, and neither name meant anything to Isaiah that night, though they would have meant a great deal to anyone who followed the business pages, because the Cole family sat atop one of the most quietly powerful fortunes in American industry: shipping, real estate, a controlling stake in companies most people had never heard of but used products from every day. None of that mattered on the shoulder of Interstate 40 in the rain. All that mattered was a 5-year-old boy shaking uncontrollably in the arms of a stranger, saying the only words he could manage over and over: "Where's my mommy? Where's my mommy?" Isaiah rode with him in the ambulance because the boy wouldn't let go of his shirt, wouldn't stop screaming the moment anyone else tried to hold him, and the paramedics, overwhelmed with the mother who was fading fast in the same vehicle, didn't have the heart to pry a terrified child off the one person keeping him calm. At the hospital, a social worker eventually came to take custody of Adrian, to begin the process of finding his next of kin, and that was supposed to be the end of Isaiah's involvement. A good deed, a strange story, to tell at the garage the next morning, nothing more. But when the social worker reached for Adrian's hand, the boy began to scream again, a sound that didn't stop, That got worse the farther she pulled him from Isaiah, until a nurse finally suggested, half out of desperation, that Isaiah stay in the room while they ran the intake interview. He stayed an hour, then 3, then the whole night, asleep sitting upright, in a plastic chair with Adrian curled against his side, because every time he tried to leave, the boy woke up screaming his name, except he didn't know Isaiah's name. So what he screamed was simply, "Don't go. Please don't go." The search for next of kin took weeks, and it revealed a complicated and quietly tragic picture. Daniel Cole had been estranged from his own father, the family patriarch, over a dispute. Nobody outside the family ever fully understood something about Daniel refusing to marry into a business alliance the old man had arranged, choosing Marissa instead, a woman with no fortune and no name that mattered to the Cole dynasty. The patriarch had cut Daniel off completely, removed him from the will, refused to speak to him for the better part of a decade. When Daniel and Marissa died on that rainy highway, there was on paper no family willing to step forward. The Cole patriarch, when contacted, apparently said only that the boy was not his concern, a sentence a caseworker would repeat to Isaiah years later with visible disgust still in her voice. So Adrian Cole, 5 years old, heir by blood to a fortune he knew nothing about, was on a fast track toward the foster system. And Isaiah Brooks, a single man running a struggling auto garage, working sometimes 60 hours a week, living in a 2-bedroom rental with a leaking roof, made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. He went to the caseworker and asked what it would take to become this boy's foster parent. And if things went well, eventually his legal guardian. People asked him for years afterward, on the rare occasions he opened up about it, why he did it. Why a man with no experience raising children, no wife, no financial cushion, would take on a traumatized 5-year-old who wasn't his blood. Isaiah's answer never changed. He held onto my shirt like I was the only solid thing left in the world. He'd say, I wasn't about to prove him wrong. The process was not simple. Isaiah was a black man in his 30s applying to foster a white child in a system that, even then, complicated by the era, asked more questions of him than it might have asked of someone who looked more like the boy in the photographs. There were home visits, financial reviews, background checks, uncomfortable interviews where Isaiah sat across from caseworkers who seemed to be searching for a reason to say no. He answered every question. He fixed up the second bedroom of his rental himself, painting it a pale blue because that was Adrian's favorite color, something the boy had mentioned once. Through tears, he took a parenting class on Saturday mornings before opening the shop. He did everything that was asked of him and some things nobody asked of him. And eventually, 14 months after the crash, Isaiah Brooks became Adrian Cole's legal guardian. He never changed the boy's last name. That was a decision Isaiah made deliberately and never wavered on, not once in 28 years. That name is the only thing his parents left him. He told a friend once, I wasn't going to take that too. So Adrian grew up as Adrian Cole in a small rented house behind a small rented garage, raised by a man everyone in the neighborhood eventually just called Pop, whether or not they were related to him. The years that followed were not easy, and Isaiah never pretended they were, not even decades later when the whole story finally came out. He worked the garage 6 days a week and picked up extra shifts doing maintenance for a trucking company on Sundays, coming home smelling like diesel and exhaustion, making dinner with hands that never quite lost the black creases of engine grease, no matter how hard he scrubbed. He missed things he'd be the first to admit it. He missed a school play once because a customer's brakes failed, and he refused to send a man back onto the road unsafe. He was late to a parent-teacher conference because a single mother down the street had her car break down, and Isaiah wouldn't let her pay for the part until she could afford it, which meant fixing it for free that week and eating the cost himself. But he was there for the things that mattered most. He was there every single night to check Adrian's homework, Even on nights he could barely keep his eyes open, sitting at the kitchen table with grease still under his fingernails, sounding out long division problems he'd never learned himself with the same patience he used adjusting a carburetor. He was there for every nightmare, and there were many years of them, nights when Adrian would wake up, screaming about rain and breaking glass, and Isaiah would sit on the edge of the bed until the boy fell back asleep, sometimes for hours, never once complaining, never once making the boy feel like a burden for needing him. He taught Adrian to work on cars starting around age 8, not because he expected the boy to become a mechanic, but because he believed a person should know how to fix things with their own hands, that there was a dignity in it no diploma could replace. Adrian turned out to have a gift for it, a mechanical mind that seemed to understand machines the way some children understand music, and by the time he was in high school, he was rebuilding engines alongside Isaiah on weekends, the two of them covered in the same grease, laughing at the same terrible radio jokes, closer than most fathers and sons who share actual blood. Isaiah never lied to Adrian about where he came from. He told him gently, gradually, as the boy grew old enough to understand, about the accident, about his parents, about how Isaiah had found him. He didn't tell him about the coal fortune, mostly because Isaiah himself hadn't dug deeply into it. He wasn't interested in money that had turned its back on a 5-year-old, and he never once, not for a single day of Adrian's childhood, tried to use the boy's background to seek out that family or that wealth on his behalf. That door was closed by people who should be ashamed, Isaiah said once. I wasn't going to go knock on it for him. If it ever opened, it had opened because it was supposed to. Money was tight for most of Adrian's childhood. There were months Isaiah skipped his own dinner so there'd be enough for 2 full plates instead of 1.5. There was a stretch during a recession when the garage nearly closed, when Isaiah worked 80-hour weeks for almost 2 years just to keep the lights on and keep Adrian in the same school with his friends. He never told Adrian how close they'd come to losing everything until Adrian was well into adulthood, and when he finally did, Adrian wept because he realized how much had been quietly absorbed by a man who never once made him feel the weight of it. Adrian excelled in school, particularly in engineering and business, subjects that seemed to run in a bloodline he didn't yet know he had. He got a partial scholarship to a state university, and Isaiah covered the rest by taking out a loan against the garage itself, a decision that terrified him privately, but that he never once presented to Adrian as a sacrifice. You're going, he said, when Adrian tried to talk him out of it, tried to suggest community college instead to save money. You're going, and you're not going to spend one day of it worrying about how it's paid for. That's my job, not yours. Adrian graduated with honors, started a small automotive technology company with 2 college friends, built on ideas he'd first sketched out on napkins in Isaiah's garage as a teenager. Smarter diagnostic tools for independent mechanics, the very kind of tools that could have made Isaiah's decades of manual troubleshooting easier if they'd existed sooner. The company grew modestly at first, then rapidly, catching the attention of larger firms, eventually catching the attention of investors who saw something bigger in it than Adrian himself had initially imagined. Isaiah watched all of this with quiet, overflowing pride, still running his same small garage on Mercer Street, still refusing every offer Adrian made to help him modernize it, retire, or move to something bigger. This garage is where I found you, Isaiah told him once when Adrian pushed the issue. I'm not walking away from it. The discovery that changed everything happened when Adrian was 32, a decade into running his own successful company, comfortable but not yet wealthy in any extraordinary sense. It began with a letter from a law firm in Chicago, formal and cold, informing him that Elias Cole, founder and longtime chairman of Coal Industries, had passed away, and that as part of an unusual and long-disputed provision in the family trust, Adrian, grandson of the deceased and last surviving direct descendant, was the sole heir to the entire coal estate. The letter listed holdings that made Adrian sit down at his kitchen table and read the page 4 times before he believed what he was seeing. Shipping terminals across 2 continents, commercial real estate in 9 major cities, a controlling interest in companies that supplied parts to half the automotive industry. Adrian had built his own small business inside of a fortune, when finally tallied by forensic accountants months later, worth just over $11 billion. Adrian's first phone call was not to a lawyer or an accountant or a reporter, though all 3 would soon be calling him relentlessly. His first call was to Isaiah, and he drove straight to the garage that same afternoon, the letter shaking in his hand, and told the only father he'd ever known what had just happened. Isaiah read the letter slowly at the counter where he usually wrote up invoices, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at Adrian for a long moment. "How do you feel about it?" Isaiah asked, which was such a purely Isaiah question. Not what will you do with it? Not what does this mean, but how do you feel? Because that was the question Isaiah had asked Adrian about every hard thing in his life. Since he was 5 years old, Adrian said he didn't know how he felt. Angry, mostly, at a grandfather he'd never met who had turned his back on a 5-year-old orphan rather than take him in. Strange, thinking about a family that had watched from a distance his entire life, apparently tracking his existence through lawyers, and never once reached out. Not for a birthday, not for a graduation, not even to check if he was alive, until there was a fortune that legally required his signature to pass on. And underneath all of it, something that felt almost like guilt, as if inheriting this money was somehow a betrayal of the man who'd actually raised him. Isaiah, in his characteristic way, cut straight through that last feeling without hesitation. "Don't you dare feel guilty about this," he said. "That money doesn't undo one single day I got to spend raising you. Nothing can touch that. You take what's yours. Just don't let it change who you are, because who you are is the best thing I ever built, better than any car I ever fixed." The transition of the estate took the better part of a year, handled by a small army of lawyers and accountants, and it did not stay private for long. Financial journalists discovered the extraordinary story behind the coal heir, the crash, the vanished family fortune, the mysterious 32-year-old who had apparently been raised in obscurity by an unrelated black mechanic in a working-class neighborhood, a detail the press found irresistible in the way the press finds any story irresistible when it involves money crossing lines it wasn't supposed to cross. Adrian's name and photograph began appearing in business publications, then general news outlets, then finally the kind of glossy society coverage that follows sudden extraordinary wealth like a hungry shadow. The pressure to step fully into the world of the Cole family name began almost immediately. Board members and executives who had worked for his grandfather for decades wanted to meet him, assess him, in some cases quietly test whether he could be steered or controlled. Distant relatives Adrian had never heard of, cousins twice removed who'd spent years scheming for their own slice of the estate before his existence became public, suddenly wanted family dinners, golf trips, an invitation into his life that felt less like affection and more like reconnaissance. A well-known lifestyle magazine wanted to do a feature on his ascension into high society, complete with a photo shoot at one of the newly inherited properties, framing him as the prodigal heir returning to his rightful world. Adrian found all of it suffocating and increasingly infuriating, because every single person now clamoring for a piece of his time, his validation, his name at their events, was someone who had known exactly where he was for 28 years and had never once come looking. Not a birthday card, not a phone call, not a single moment of the childhood that had actually shaped him. The only person who had shown up every day without fail, without any promise of reward, was a man these same people had spent 30 years driving past without a second glance, a man some of them had personally mocked in his own garage without knowing who he was to the boy who would become their industry's newest titan. That detail mattered more than anyone in Adrian's new orbit understood, because Isaiah's garage had, over the years, occasionally serviced the very kind of clientele who now wanted Adrian's attention-wealthy customers in the neighborhood who brought their luxury cars to the small shop because Isaiah's reputation for honest, meticulous work had spread quietly over decades, even among people who would never have invited him to their homes. And more than a few of those customers had, at one point or another, treated Isaiah with a thinly veiled condescension that Adrian had witnessed firsthand growing up, had seethed over as a teenager washing windshields in the same lot, had never forgotten. There was the man who used to snap his fingers at Isaiah to hurry up, as if he were staff, rather than the shop's owner. There was the woman who once asked Isaiah, with a saccharine smile, if he'd gone to a real school for this, as if 3 decades of expertise required her validation. There was the customer, a local real estate developer with a habit of parking his Mercedes crookedly across 2 spots, who liked to joke to other customers within Isaiah's earshot that men like him were lucky to have work at all in this economy, laughing as if it were harmless. Isaiah had absorbed every one of these moments with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything, never arguing, never groveling either, simply doing excellent work and letting his hands speak for him. Adrian had absorbed them too, silently, filing them away with a patience that would eventually run out. When the wealth management team assigned to Adrian's new estate suggested, gently at first and then more insistently, that his upcoming public debut into Cole family social circles should probably not include unnecessary complications, meaning Isaiah, meaning the modest garage, meaning any visible trace of the working-class life that had actually raised him, Adrian understood with sudden clarity what path they expected him to walk. They expected him to accept the fortune and quietly leave the man who'd earned it for him behind, tucked into a comfortable retirement somewhere out of frame, a footnote in the origin story rather than its center. Adrian said no to all of it, and he said it in a way nobody expected. He didn't do the magazine photo shoot at the inherited estate. He didn't attend the black tie gala the board had planned to formally welcome him into the family's philanthropic circle. Instead, he called a small number of journalists he trusted, the ones who had covered his rise with more curiosity than opportunism, and told them there would be one public event, on one specific date, at one specific location, and that they were welcome to attend if they wanted to understand who he actually was. The location was Isaiah's garage on Mercer Street. Isaiah didn't know any of this was coming. Adrian had deliberately kept him out of the planning, partly to protect him from the anxiety of anticipation, and partly, Adrian admitted, much later, because he wanted his father's reaction to be completely real, uncoached, unrehearsed, the same honesty Isaiah had given him every single day of his life. So on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with the same wealthy customers who'd spent years mildly humiliating him scattered around the lot waiting on oil changes and brake jobs, Isaiah was elbow deep in a transmission when he heard car doors, many of them, closing in unison. Outside, he wiped his hands on his rag and stepped out to see what looked like a small motorcade. Filling his modest parking lot, security men in dark suits, a small cluster of people with cameras held at a respectful distance, and in the middle of it, walking toward him with tears already forming, the boy he'd pulled from a wrecked sedan 28 years earlier, now a grown man in a suit that cost more than Isaiah's truck, but with the exact same eyes that had once looked up at him from a hospital bed and refused to let go of his shirt. "Dad," Adrian said, closing the distance between them in a few long strides, and the customers who had gathered to watch, confused about what Billionaire could possibly be, visiting this rundown shop, went completely silent as the richest young man in the industry wrapped his arms around a grease-stained mechanic and held on like he was 5 years old. "Again, I'm finally home." Isaiah, not a man given to public displays of emotion, didn't even try to hold back. He gripped the back of Adrian's expensive suit jacket with hands still smudged from the transmission he'd been working on and wept openly in the middle of his own parking lot, in front of customers, in front of cameras, in front of a moment neither of them had ever imagined would look quite like this. The developer with the crooked parked Mercedes stood frozen near the front of the shop, his mouth slightly open, watching the man he'd joked about for years being embraced by a young man whose face he now recognized from every business headline of the past several months. The woman who'd once asked Isaiah if he'd attended a real school stood near her. Range Rover, her expression somewhere between shock and dawning, uncomfortable, understanding. When Adrian finally stepped back, still holding both of Isaiah's shoulders, he turned not toward the cameras, but toward the small crowd of customers watching in disbelief, and he spoke, his voice unsteady but clear enough for every recorder to catch it. "Some of you have been coming to this garage for years," he said. "Some of you have talked to this man like he was less than you, like his hands being covered in grease made him less important than your hands being covered in nothing at all. I need you to understand something. This man is the reason I know how to work hard. He's the reason I know how to be honest. Every single thing I have built, every company, every dollar the lawyers say now belongs to me. All of it exists because a mechanic with 2 jobs and a leaking roof decided a 5-year-old stranger was worth raising as his own son. There is no Cole fortune. There is no version of me that matters without him." The journalist Adrian had invited captured every word, and within days the story had traveled far beyond the small radius of Mercer Street, into national headlines, into a viral moment that framed the encounter exactly as it deserved to be framed, not as a billionaire's charity toward an old friend, but as a son's declaration that blood was never what had made him family. In the weeks that followed, the pressure Adrian had anticipated arrived exactly as expected. Distant Cole relatives, embarrassed by the public spotlight now on their years of absence, suggested through intermediaries that Adrian's sentimental gesture was admirable, but that it was time to move forward, to focus on the responsibilities of the estate, to consider whether continuing to associate publicly with a small-town mechanic was, as one cousin's lawyer delicately put it, on brand for the family's future. Adrian's answer to that suggestion, delivered personally and without a lawyer present, was short. He informed the family that Isaiah Brooks would be listed as his father on every legal document where the word applied, that Isaiah would have a permanent seat on the board of the newly formed Cole Family Foundation, and that any relative uncomfortable with that arrangement was welcome to remove themselves from his life the way they'd already removed themselves from it for 28 years. What Adrian did next surprised even Isaiah, who by that point assumed he'd run out of ways to be surprised by the boy he'd raised. Rather than quietly wrapping the garage into some symbolic footnote of his origin story, Adrian used a portion of the inheritance to launch an initiative he named, simply, the Mercer Street Fund, dedicated to providing grants and low-interest loans to independent auto shops and small mechanics across the country who couldn't otherwise access capital to modernize their equipment or survive economic downturns, the very kind of support that might have saved Isaiah 2 decades of 80-hour weeks if it had existed when he needed it. He didn't rebuild the Mercer Street garage into something unrecognizable either. Isaiah refused any renovation that would change the character of the place, so Adrian instead quietly paid off the loan Isaiah had taken out against the shop years earlier to fund his college tuition, a debt Isaiah had never told him the full size of, and arranged for the building itself to be permanently deeded to Isaiah free and clear, so no bank, no downer, and no circumstance could ever again threaten to take it from him. Isaiah kept working. That was perhaps the detail that confused outsiders most, the fact that a man whose son now controlled a multi-billion-dollar empire still showed up to the garage at 7 every morning, still changed oil and rebuilt transmissions with his own hands, still wore the same grease-stained coveralls he'd worn for 30 years. When reporters occasionally asked him why, expecting some sentimental answer about staying humble, Isaiah usually just shrugged. "This is what I know how to do," he'd say. "I raised a boy right. I'm not going to stop doing honest work just because his life got complicated." The wealthy customers who returned to the shop afterward, and most of them did return, whether out of genuine remorse or simple embarrassment at the alternative, found a version of Isaiah that hadn't changed at all. He didn't gloat. He didn't hold the moment over anyone. The developer with the crooked Mercedes came in a week later, parked his car with unusual, almost comic precision, and apologized in a stammering, awkward way that Isaiah accepted with the same quiet grace he brought to everything else. "Water under the bridge," Isaiah told him, and meant it because holding on to old resentments had never been part of how he moved through the world. The story that spread across the country in the months following that morning outside the garage resonated with people for reasons that had very little to do with the $1 billion involved. It resonated because it reversed an assumption so many people carry without examining it, the assumption that a person's worth can be measured by their clothes, their bank account, the shine on their shoes, rather than by what they're willing to sacrifice for someone who has nothing to offer them in return. Isaiah Brooks had rescued a screaming 5-year-old from a wrecked car, expecting nothing, had raised him for 18 years, expecting nothing, had funded his college education by mortgaging his own livelihood, expecting nothing, and the return on that investment, when it finally came, was never really the $11 billion. The return was a grown man walking through an oil-stained garage, past every person who had ever underestimated the mechanic inside it, to hold on to him and say the one word that mattered more than any inheritance ever could. Adrian Cole eventually became one of the most quietly respected figures in American business, known as much for the discipline and humility he brought to running his companies as for the scale of the fortune he'd inherited, a reputation people who met him often attributed correctly to the way he'd been raised. He never moved into any of the Cole family's inherited mansions, choosing instead a modest house not far from Mercer Street, close enough that he still stopped by the garage most Sunday mornings to help his father with whatever needed fixing, the two of them still covered in the same grease, still laughing at the same terrible jokes, exactly as they had for nearly 3 decades. And Isaiah, when people finally asked him years later what he wanted people to take from his story, gave an answer that never wavered, the same answer in every interview, every article, every quiet conversation on the same street corner where he'd spent his whole life. "I didn't save that boy because I knew who his family was," he'd say. "I didn't know, and it wouldn't have mattered if I did. I saved him because he was a child who needed someone, and I was the person standing there." That's the whole story. Everything after that was just showing up every single day for as long as it took. He'd pause then, usually, and look toward the garage bay where Adrian, billionaire or not, was still elbow-deep in some old engine, exactly where he'd always wanted to be. "Some people think love is supposed to look impressive," Isaiah would say. "It's not. It's supposed to look like showing up. That's all it ever was. That's all it ever needed to be."